Let me give you the sentence that matters most before anything else. Because everything I say for the next several minutes depends on whether you can receive it. The house you were raised in was not your origin. It was your cover. I want you to sit with that, because I know what happens in a lot of people when they hear it. Something in your chest just moved. Not because you're emotional, because something you've carried since you were small, something you never had language for, just got named out loud for the first time. You always suspected it. You just never had permission to say it. You looked around the table you grew up at, and you loved those people. And you were still a stranger there. You spoke their language. You ate their food. You learned their rules, and you kept most of them. And still, somewhere underneath all of it, there was this quiet, persistent knowing that you were not from there. Not in the way they were. You couldn't explain it. You couldn't defend it. You certainly couldn't say it out loud at Thanksgiving. So you buried it, and you got good at fitting in, and you told yourself it was just restlessness, or ingratitude, or that thing about you that never quite settled. It wasn't restlessness. It was blood. There is a man in Scripture whose entire life turns on this exact thing, and most people read his story and completely miss what it is actually about. They think it's about a baby in a basket. It's not. It's about a bloodline that was hidden on purpose inside the very house that was trying to destroy it. Moses was Hebrew. He grew up Egyptian. Understand what that means. Pharaoh had given the order. Every Hebrew boy thrown into the river. And a mother named Jochebed did something that looks like desperation and was actually strategy. She took a basket, sealed it with tar and pitch, laid her son inside it, and put him in the exact river that was supposed to swallow him. She did not hide him from the water. She hid him in the water. And that basket floated to the one place in all of Egypt where no soldier would dare touch it. Pharaoh's daughter's bathing spot. Now here's the part almost nobody talks about. The baby cries. The princess picks him up and says, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." She knows. She knows exactly what he is. And Miriam, the boy's sister, who has been standing in the reeds this whole time watching, steps forward and says something so bold it should have gotten her killed. "Shall I go get a Hebrew woman to nurse him for you?" And the princess says yes. And Miriam goes and gets his own mother. Read what happens next slowly, because it is one of the most staggering sentences in the Old Testament. Pharaoh's daughter says to Jochebed, "Take this child and nurse him for me, and I will pay you your wages." Pharaoh's own household paid a Hebrew slave woman to raise her own son. The empire that was trying to erase that bloodline ended up funding it, feeding it, protecting it. And it never knew. For years, the ancient world weaned late. We're talking about years, not months. That boy sat in his real mother's lap and heard the real story. He heard about Abraham. He heard about the promise. He heard the name of a God who was not carved out of stone and hung on a temple wall. Whatever Egypt would teach him later, it was built on top of a foundation that was laid in secret, in a slave's house, on borrowed time, paid for by his enemy. And then he went back to the palace and became a prince. I want you to feel the whole weight of that arrangement, because I believe it is the arrangement some of you have been living your entire life without recognizing it. You were raised in one house and belonged to another. You learned the language of a place that was not your home. You learned to move through rooms that were never designed for what you actually are. You picked up their manners and their expectations and their measurements of success. And you got good at it. That's the part people miss. You got good at it, and all the while there was a second education happening underneath. In the quiet, in the dark, in the moments nobody witnessed. a grandmother who prayed over you, a hymn you heard through a wall, a night when you were 9 years old and you knew, without anyone telling you, that God was real and that he knew your name. That was Jochebed's lap. That was the wages being paid. And listen to me, Egypt was not wasted on Moses. This is important. Everything he learned in that palace, he used later. The Hebrew slaves had no idea how the Egyptian court worked. Moses did. He knew the protocol. He knew how Pharaoh's mind moved. He knew which room to stand in and how to speak to a man who thought he was a god. God did not rescue him out of the palace. God planted him in it, took the training, and left the bloodline intact. So if you're sitting there with a ursum full of things that don't look spiritual, hear this. The years you spent in a job you hated, the industry you fell into by accident, the family system that taught you to read a room before you entered it, because you had to, because it wasn't safe. That was training. Ugly, expensive training that you would never have volunteered for, and it belongs to you now. Nothing about you is an accident of placement. There's a woman I think about, a nurse in Tulsa, 3rd shift, 22 years on the floor. She grew up in a house where faith was a joke. Her father used to laugh at the neighbors leaving for church on Sunday morning. Laugh out loud. From the driveway, with the hood of the truck up. She had no vocabulary for God until she was 26 years old. And now she is the one they call for at 3 in the morning, when a family is standing in a hallway, and the doctor has already said everything he knows how to say. She doesn't preach. She holds hands. She says the right sentence at the right moment, and nobody can explain where she learned it. She didn't learn it. She inherited it. I think about a man I know outside Erie. A welder, big hands, 41 years old. The kind of man who has never once used the word spiritual to describe himself. He grew up in a house where nobody talked about anything. You didn't cry. You didn't ask. You handled it. And that man is the one every guy on his crew goes to when their marriage is falling apart in the parking lot at shift change. He doesn't know why. He told me once, almost embarrassed, that people just start telling him things. He thinks it's a personality quirk. It isn't a quirk. It's a bloodline showing through a house that tried to seal it shut. That's the thing about what's actually in you. It leaks. It comes out sideways in the way you notice the one person at the party who isn't okay, in the fact that strangers tell you things they've never told their own families. And here's where it gets real, because there is a second half to Moses' story that almost everybody rushes past, and it's the half most of you are actually living in right now. The bloodline surfaces before the calling arrives. Moses is 40 years old. He's a prince. He has everything Egypt can give a man, and one day he walks out and sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, and something rises up in him that has nothing to do with his education. Scripture is very careful here. It says he looked this way and that way, saw no one, and killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. That was not a prince acting. That was blood acting. 40 years of palace training, and none of it held. He saw one of his own being crushed, and his real identity came up out of him like water breaking through a wall. He didn't plan it. He couldn't stop it. And then this is the human part. This is the part I love. He looked around first. And afterward, he hid the body. Because a piece of him still wanted to be an Egyptian tomorrow morning. You know that moment. You know the moment when the thing in you that you've kept managed and quiet finally broke the surface. Maybe it was a room where everyone was laughing at somebody, and you were the only one who couldn't. Maybe it was a decision at work that everybody signed off on, and you physically could not sign. Maybe it was a friendship you had to walk away from, and you couldn't give anybody a reason that made sense. You just knew. And then you spent the next month looking this way and that way, trying to bury it in the sand, hoping nobody had seen. Somebody saw. The next day, Moses goes back out, and two Hebrews are fighting, and he tries to break it up, and one of them turns and says the sentence that ends his whole life as he knew it. "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me like you killed the Egyptian?" Word got out. And notice who exposed him. Not Egypt, not Pharaoh's guards. His own people. The ones he'd risked everything for. The ones whose blood he shared. I need you to hear that. Because some of you are still trying to understand why the deepest wound you carry didn't come from the world. It came from the church pew. From the cousin. From the people who should have recognized you first and didn't. The house that raised you may never know what you are. But it's the people who share your blood and reject you anyway that send you into the desert, and that's what happened. Moses ran. He ended up in Midian, sitting by a well in the middle of nowhere, a fugitive with an Egyptian accent and a Hebrew heart, wanted by one nation and unwanted by the other. He married a Midianite girl. He worked for her father. He named his first son Gershom, which means a stranger there, and he said out loud, "I have been a stranger in a foreign land." 40 years he kept somebody else's sheep. 40 years in a place where nobody knew he had ever been a prince, and nobody would have believed him if he'd told them. If that is where you are right now, I want you to understand what the desert actually did. It stripped Egypt off of him. He walked into Midian as a man who moved like royalty, who had eaten at the finest table in the ancient world, who had been taught by the best minds of the empire, who could have led a rebellion on charisma and credentials alone. And God let all of it go quiet for 4 decades, until the only thing left standing in him was the thing his mother put there before he could form sentences. Because God was not going to send a prince to Pharaoh. He was going to send a shepherd with a stick. Look at Jephthah, because his story sits right on top of this, and almost nobody preaches it. He was the son of Gilead, by a woman nobody would name at a family gathering. His half-brothers grew up, and when the inheritance came into view, they threw him out of the house. They said it to his face, "You will not inherit in our father's house. Because you are the son of another woman. You are not one of us." He went to the land of Tob and made a life out of nothing, and worthless men gathered to him. And he became a mighty man of valor in a place where nobody had a pedigree. And then the Ammonites came against Israel, and the same elders who had signed off on his exile, the same men who had watched his brothers put him out, and said nothing, got in a cart and drove out to Tob to find him. He asked them the only question worth asking. "Didn't you hate me? Didn't you drive me out of my father's house? Why have you come to me now that you're in trouble?" They didn't argue. They just said, "That is why we're here now." The house that threw him out came back for him, because the crisis that arrived required the exact man they had disqualified. Some of you are in Tob right now. You are building something in a place that doesn't count, with people nobody respects, doing work no one from your old life would take seriously. And you are being formed for a phone call that has not come yet. Don't waste Tob. Don't spend it bitter and shrunk down and rehearsing what they said about you at the front door. Build, because the day is coming when the trouble in that house will be bigger than the pride in that house. And pride always loses that fight eventually. Now I want to be honest with you about something before I go any further, because I don't want to stand here sounding like a man who read this in a book. My name is George, and I spent about 6 years of my life absolutely certain that I had been placed in the wrong story. I don't mean I was unhappy. I want to be precise. I was fine. I had work. I had people who loved me. From the outside, there was nothing to fix. But I could not get rid of the sense that there was a version of my life running somewhere on the other side of a wall, and I could hear it, and I could not get to it. And I did what a lot of you have done. I decided the problem was me, that the sense of otherness was arrogance, dressed up in spiritual language. That wanting more meant I was ungrateful for what I had. So I put it down. I stopped talking about it. And I got very, very good at the room I was standing in. The thing that broke it open was not a revelation. It was a Tuesday. I was in my car in a parking lot, outside a grocery store, and I had just had an ordinary conversation with an ordinary person. And I sat there with the keys in my hand and I said, out loud, to nobody, I don't know who I am supposed to be. And the answer that came back was not comfort. It was one sentence, and it went straight through me. You already know. You've been pretending you don't, so you don't have to move. That was the day the basket came apart. And everything I've built since then came out of what happened after I stopped pretending the keys I found. One at a time, the hard way. Over years I can't get back. God does not move things without purpose. If this message reached you today, there was a reason before you ever clicked. The secret protocol carries the 7 keys that reveal what was deposited in you before your birth, and what the Spirit is beginning to awaken in this exact season. The full audiobook is included to walk with you in your quiet moments, and the awakening map as a bonus unveiling the 5 stages of spiritual awakening, where you have been, where you are, and what is coming. Link pinned in the first comment. But divine windows do not stay open indefinitely. Now let me take you to the bush, because this is where the hidden bloodline finally gets named. Moses is 80 years old. Half his life in a palace, half his life in a pasture. He is out on the backside of the desert with sheep that belong to somebody else. And he sees a bush burning that will not burn up, and he turns aside to look. And God calls him by name. Twice Moses, Moses. And then God does something I want you to catch. He does not say, I am the God of Egypt, and I've noticed you. He says, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Your father, 80 years old, raised by an empire, and the first thing heaven does is put him back into his own genealogy. Before the assignment, before the miracles, before the rod and the plagues and the sea. God reestablishes the bloodline first, because a man cannot carry an inheritance he doesn't believe belongs to him. That is what some of you have been waiting for and didn't know how to ask for. Not a door, not an opportunity, a name. You need heaven to say out loud whose you are, because you have spent your whole life being introduced as somebody else's. And then watch Moses' response, because it will comfort you. He argues, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? They won't believe me. They won't listen to my voice. And then the one that always gets me, I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. I've never been eloquent, not before, and not now that you're talking to me. A man raised in the most sophisticated court on earth tells God he can't talk. You know why? Because he had spent 40 years not being anyone. The palace was gone. The prince was gone. And when God showed up and said, go, all he could see was the version of himself he'd become in the desert. So God asks him a question that has nothing to do with eloquence. What is that in your hand? A rod, a shepherd's stick, a stripped branch from the least important season of his life. Throw it down. He throws it down, and it becomes a serpent, and Moses runs from it, which I find deeply human. Pick it up by the tail. He picks it up, and it becomes a rod again. And from that moment on, Scripture stops calling it the rod of Moses. It starts calling it the rod of God. The tool of the desert became the instrument of deliverance. Every ordinary thing in your hand right now, the skill you don't respect, because it came from a season you're ashamed of, the patience you learned in a hard marriage, the way you can talk to angry people because you grew up managing one, that is the rod. God is not going to hand you something new to hold. He is going to sanctify what you were already holding, while you thought you were wasting your life. And then there's the second sign, and it's the strangest one, and it is exactly on the theme of everything I've said to you today. Put your hand in your cloak. He puts it in, pulls it out, and it's leprous, white as snow. Put it back in. He puts it back and pulls it out, and it's restored. The hidden place is where the change happens. Not on the stage, not in front of Pharaoh. Inside the cloak, where no one can see, where there is no audience and no applause, and no confirmation from anybody watching. That is where God does the work that proves who sent you. Some of you have been hidden so long you've decided it's punishment. It's not. It's the cloak. You are being changed in the only place where the change can't be faked. And I know what the hidden season costs, so I'm not going to romanticize it. It costs you the ability to explain yourself. People ask what you're doing now and you don't have a clean answer, so you give them a short one and change the subject. It costs you the comfort of being understood. It costs you the version of your life you had already described to everyone. That is not a small thing to lose, and if you're grieving it, you're not weak. Moses lost a throne and got a flock. He didn't skip the grief. He just kept walking the sheep out past the wilderness, day after day, for 4 decades, until the day he took them one direction further than usual and found the mountain. And I'll tell you who else understood this. Amos. He was not a prophet. He said so himself, plainly, when the priest at Bethel told him to go away and prophesy somewhere else where he could earn his bread. He said, "I was no prophet, neither was I a prophet's son. I was a herdsman and a gatherer of sycamore fruit. And the Lord took me as I followed the flock and said, 'Go prophesy to my people Israel.'" No lineage, no school, no credential from anybody's institution. Taken from behind the flock. If you have been waiting for someone with authority to certify you before you'll believe God is speaking through you, you may be waiting for a piece of paper that heaven has no intention of issuing. And Abigail, married to a man named Nabal, a harsh, drunk, foolish man whose own servants said you can't even talk to him. She lived in that house. She ran that house, and when 400 armed men were coming down the mountain to wipe out everything her husband owned because of his mouth, she got on a donkey with 200 loaves and rode out to meet the future king of Israel. And she talked him out of murder with a speech that David later said saved him from blood guilt. She was in the wrong house. She was not the wrong woman. And when Nabal died, David sent for her, and she went from that house to the household of a king. The whole time she was married to that man, she was being trained in wisdom, timing, and how to speak to power under pressure, and the moment came, and she was ready. And nobody in her old house had any idea what she was. Here is what I want you to walk away holding. The house you were raised in did not define your bloodline. It concealed it, and in some cases it fed it, paid for it, educated it, and handed it back to you, without ever knowing what it was doing. You are not a mistake in your family. You are a deposit in your family. And there is going to come a day, for some of you it's closer than you think, when the thing that made you strange in that house becomes the only reason you're able to stand where God is going to put you. Moses did not lose Egypt. He walked back into it, through the front gate, with a stick in his hand and a bloodline in his chest, And he said to the most powerful man alive, "Let my people go." The boy from the river came back for the river. So here's what I want from you, and I want you to be specific with me, because generic doesn't help anybody. In the comments, tell me 2 things. First, the name of the town or the house you grew up in, just the place. And second, the one thing they said you were, that you now know you're not. The label. The role they gave you at that table. Write it out. I read these, and I want to see how many of us were raised under a name that was never actually ours. This channel is created without ads and without platform income. If these messages have touched your heart, strengthened your faith, or helped you during a difficult moment, and you'd like to support this work, you can use the QR code on your screen or the contribution link in the pinned comment. Thank you for walking this path with us. And one more thing before you go. Jochebed made that basket herself. She sealed it with her own hands, knowing she would have to let go of it, knowing the water would carry it somewhere she could not follow. She didn't build it to keep him. She built it to get him past the soldiers. Whatever it was that held you through the years you don't like to talk about, that was the basket. It was never meant to be your home. It was meant to get you to the palace.